AITA for telling my brother his son isn't his after overhearing my SIL's affair? My brother, Liam, is a good man. He's the kind of big brother every kid wants, protective, funny, always there when you need him. He's 2 years older than me, which always felt like the perfect age gap. Growing up, he was my hero, even as we got older. I knew he'd always look out for me. We don't have that super close sibling bond some people talk about. But we've always understood each other. Family is family, and there's nothing I wouldn't do for him. When Liam met Anna, I'll admit, I was skeptical. She was beautiful and smart. Someone who carried herself with a calm, almost cool confidence. She seemed perfect for him. In that opposites attract way. Liam is friendly and kind of outgoing, and she was more reserved. But I chalked it up to her being shy or maybe just introverted. They seemed to balance each other well enough, and I was happy for him. Still, over the years, I couldn't shake this weird feeling about her. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. Not exactly. It's just that Anna always felt a little off. Like there was some invisible barrier she kept between herself and everyone else. I told myself I was overthinking it. That maybe it was just my own protectiveness kicking in. A leftover instinct from childhood. I wanted to trust his judgment. He's never been the impulsive type. So if he loved her, that was enough. After they got married, they had their son, Ben, and I think that's when I started to really question things. Liam absolutely adored that kid. From the moment Ben was born, he was wrapped around his little finger. Liam's the kind of dad who dives headfirst into the messiness of parenting, diaper duty, bedtime stories, even middle-of-the-night lullabies. He wanted to be there for every milestone, every scraped knee, and every tiny triumph in Ben's life. But even with Ben around, Anna stayed distant. Not that she was a bad mom, she did the usual things. Kept the house in order. Made sure Ben had what he needed. But it was as if she was going through the motions. There was this lack of warmth. A kind of detachment that was hard to ignore. Especially when Liam was so naturally affectionate. It wasn't anything he ever brought up. And I doubt he even noticed it. But I did. Whenever I visited, I'd watch Anna out of the corner of my eye, wondering if she was really as invested in this life as my brother was. I mean, I didn't want to judge. Especially since every marriage has its own dynamic. But that feeling stuck with me. It gnawed at the back of my mind whenever I saw her with Liam. Or even just in passing. Sometimes, I'd catch her looking at Ben with this strange look, a mix of love and something else I couldn't place. I hated thinking it, but it always seemed like she was holding back. Like there was some deeper part of her that wasn't really in this family. Maybe it was silly of me to worry. I had no proof, no reason to think anything was wrong. But even without evidence, instincts can be stubborn things. And mine kept nagging at me. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself. After all, I had no right to interfere in my brother's happiness based on a hunch. So I told myself to let it go. Just be there for him. I thought, let them live their life. Maybe, in time, I'd come to understand her. Or that strange feeling would just fade away. But as it turned out, that feeling wasn't just my imagination. It was a warning, one I was never prepared to hear. It was a normal afternoon. Or at least that's how it started. I had a few things to drop off for Ben. A toy truck I'd found that I thought he'd love. And a little stuffed bear with a red scarf. Silly little things. But I'd seen them at the store and thought of him immediately. Ben has a way of brightening the whole room with that little smile of his. And bringing him a gift, no matter how small, felt like a way of sharing in that brightness. When I got to their house, I knocked and waited, feeling the crispness of fall in the air. Anna answered the door, looking surprised to see me. But she smiled, and I smiled back. We exchanged polite greetings, the usual small talk, and she invited me inside. Liam wasn't home, he was still at work. She said I was welcome to wait if I wanted to catch him. And since I didn't have anywhere else pressing to be, I figured why not? I sat in the living room, arranging Ben's toys on the coffee table and settling in. Anna was in the kitchen, and I could hear her moving around. The sound of cabinets opening and closing. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I flipped through a magazine, half distracted, just passing the time. Then I heard her talking. Quietly at first. Almost a murmur. And I didn't catch her words. I assumed it was just a quick call to Liam or maybe a friend. But then a phrase drifted through the space between us. I can't let him find out that Ben isn't his. He'd never forgive me. I froze. Magazine slipping from my fingers as the words seeped into my mind. Slowly at first. Then with a sudden clarity that made my stomach twist. My heart pounded. A heavy, relentless thud that seemed to echo louder than her voice. Had I misheard? Maybe I was imagining it? I tried to convince myself that I'd misunderstood. That I'd caught only part of the conversation. Some random phrase that had no real meaning. But her voice continued, and the clarity sharpened. I know it's hard, she said, and her voice trembled slightly. But you knew this would be the risk when we got involved. I sat there, frozen, every nerve on edge as she continued her hushed conversation. Oblivious to the fact that I was still there. Mark was his name. And he worked with her. The more she spoke, the worse it got. They'd been seeing each other for 4 years. Almost the entire time she'd been with Liam. My stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. One by one, painting a picture I wished I could unsee. Ben wasn't my brother's son. Those words kept repeating in my head. Looping over and over until they were all I could hear. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. To find a way out. A way to make this not be true. But the truth was clear. She'd hidden this. Let Liam believe he was Ben's father all this time. She'd let him pour his heart and soul into that boy. Knowing all along that he wasn't his. I didn't know how long I sat there. Feeling sick and numb. My mind a storm of disbelief and anger. Part of me wanted to burst into the kitchen. Confront her right then and there. But another part of me, maybe the smarter part, held back. I couldn't trust myself to say or do anything in that moment without letting all of my emotions spill out in a way that would only make things worse. I felt like a trespasser in that house. Suddenly out of place. As though the walls themselves were suffocating me. Without saying a word, I rose, grabbing my things and heading for the door as quietly as I could. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was afraid if I looked back, I'd see something on Anna's face that would make me snap. That would pull me into a confrontation I wasn't ready for. So, I left, closing the door gently behind me, leaving the weight of that horrible knowledge sealed within their walls. The drive home was a blur. I remember gripping the steering wheel, my hands shaking, my vision clouded by a layer of tears I refused to let fall. I didn't know what to do. I kept replaying the words I'd heard in my mind, trying to make sense of them, trying to rationalize them, as if there was some other explanation. But I couldn't escape the truth. I couldn't escape the fact that I'd stumbled upon a secret that had the power to destroy my brother's entire life. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch. The silence of my apartment only making everything seem more real. What had I gotten myself into? What was I supposed to do now? Part of me wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. To go back to that moment before I walked through their door. Before I heard those words. But that was impossible. I knew what I knew. And there was no going back. The hours ticked by, and as the sun set, I sat alone, wrestling with myself, wondering what kind of sister I'd be if I kept this to myself. After that day, nothing felt right. I'd come home from work, go about my routine, try to focus on small things that might distract me. But everything felt off. That one piece of knowledge weighed me down, filling every quiet moment with a thudding reminder that I was sitting on a truth I never should have known. My nights were the worst. The minute my head hit the pillow, I'd be wide awake, my mind spinning with the same questions over and over. Should I tell him? Could I really be the one to shatter his entire world? And yet, how could I sit there, spending holidays and weekends with him, watching him love a child he thought was his own when I knew the truth? I was torn, caught between the gut-wrenching horror of my knowledge and the loyalty I owed him. I started avoiding him. Whenever he texted or called, I found myself making excuses, pretending to be busy, saying I was just catching up on things. I couldn't bear the thought of facing him, of seeing his smile and knowing that any happiness he felt was built on a lie he didn't even know existed. He'd ask if everything was all right, and I'd brush it off, trying not to sound as hollow as I felt. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively going over my memories of Anna and Liam together. I tried to recall every moment that might have hinted at this hidden truth. Anything that would tell me this wasn't as shocking as it felt. But I came up with nothing. They looked perfect on the surface. And every memory of them felt like some kind of trap now. A cruel disguise for what I'd uncovered. I tried talking to a couple of close friends without giving away too many details. What would you do if you found out something that could destroy someone's life? I'd ask. Would you want to know if your whole world was a lie? The responses I got were all over the place. Some people thought ignorance might be better. That maybe I should just let sleeping dogs lie and let them work out whatever they needed on their own. Others said they'd want to know. That it was better to face the truth, no matter how brutal, than to live in a happy lie. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't pretend not to know. I couldn't look my brother in the eyes. See him pour himself into fatherhood, all while knowing it was under false pretenses. The thought of him holding Ben, looking at him with all the love and pride of a father who believes in a future. A future with a son who would carry his legacy, his name, knowing that it wasn't real felt like a betrayal in itself. As the days passed, I became more convinced that I had to tell him. But even then, I hesitated. I imagined his reaction over and over. Would he believe me? Could he ever forgive me for telling him something so devastating? There was no guidebook for this. No way to soften the impact. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that it would break him. The night before I finally made the decision, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every reason to tell him and every reason to stay quiet, battling for space in my mind. I imagined our childhood, the way he always looked out for me, how he had always been my protector. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just this once, it was my turn to protect him, even if it meant hurting him more than I could bear to imagine. The next day, I called him and asked if we could meet up for coffee. My voice was shaky, but I did my best to sound calm. He probably sensed something was off. But he didn't press. We agreed to meet at a little cafe we'd both gone to countless times before. It was a familiar place. Somewhere that felt safe, though nothing felt safe anymore. As I drove there, my stomach was in knots. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to turn back, to pretend this was all a nightmare I could shake off. But I kept going. It felt like I was walking towards some inevitable storm, one that would tear everything apart. But I couldn't turn away. Not now. When I got to the cafe, he was already there, waiting at a table by the window. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. That easy, trusting smile I'd grown up with. It almost broke me right then and there. I knew this was the last time I'd see him look at me without the weight of what I was about to tell him. I sat down, trying to act normal, but my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. For a few moments, we made small talk, me asking about his day and him talking about work and Ben. Hearing him talk about Ben made everything ache even more. I nodded along, forcing myself to smile, but my mind was already spinning, trying to find the right words to start with. Finally, I took a deep breath. And before I could lose my nerve, I said, "Liam, I need to tell you something. Something really serious." He looked at me, his brow furrowing, but he didn't say anything. Just waited, his eyes filled with the same concern and trust I'd known my whole life. I took another deep breath, feeling the words lodge in my throat, heavy and painful. "I was at your house last week." I began slowly, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I heard something Anna said." I saw his eyes widen a little, confusion mixing with concern, but he didn't interrupt. "Liam," I forced myself to continue. "I overheard her talking on the phone. She was talking to someone named Mark. I didn't mean to hear it. I swear. But, she was saying that Ben isn't yours." The silence that followed was suffocating. He looked at me, disbelief, pain, and shock all swirling in his expression. I saw his hand clench into a fist on the table, his knuckles turning as white as mine had been. He didn't say anything, and I didn't push. I just sat there, watching as his world crumbled, piece by piece. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, filled with a pain so raw it made my chest ache. Are you sure? I nodded, feeling the weight of my own words crashing down on both of us. I told him everything I'd heard. Every awful, heartbreaking detail. By the end, he was pale, staring off into the distance as if the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. He didn't say much after that. He got up, nodded to me stiffly, and walked out, leaving me alone at the table. I sat there for a long time, my own heart breaking as I watched him disappear into the distance, knowing that our lives would never be the same. And as I sat there, feeling the cold emptiness of the cafe around me, I wondered if I'd made the right choice, or if I'd just made the worst mistake of my life. The hours after I told Liam felt endless. I barely remember driving home, staring blankly out the window, my mind drifting in and out, unable to hold on to any coherent thought. All I could think about was Liam's face, pale, stunned, as if I'd just taken everything good in his life and thrown it into chaos. I couldn't escape the echo of his voice when he'd asked me, Are you sure? The disbelief, the pain, the hollow echo of someone losing their entire world. I'd done that to him. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for some message, some call, some confirmation that this nightmare was real. The guilt weighed on me, creeping into every thought, every breath. The silence felt heavy and unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. Then, around midnight, my phone buzzed. I jumped, my heart pounding, and grabbed it off the nightstand. It was a text from Liam. I confronted her. That was all it said. Just 2 words, and yet they carried so much pain, so much finality. I sat up, staring at the screen, my hands trembling. I wanted to ask what happened, if he was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. There was nothing I could say that would make this better. Nothing that could soften the truth he was now facing. The next day, I went about my routine, trying to keep my mind off of it. But every quiet moment brought me back to Liam, to Anna, to Ben. I kept checking my phone, half expecting to hear from him, to get an update, but it stayed silent. The longer the day dragged on, the heavier my heart felt. I kept thinking of all the little ways this would change his life, every family dinner, every holiday, every moment with Ben now tainted by the knowledge of who he really was. Finally, in the late afternoon, my phone rang. I answered quickly, and for a second there was only silence. I could hear Liam breathing on the other end, slow and steady, like he was trying to pull himself together just enough to talk. She admitted it, he said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. She didn't even deny it. I swallowed hard, feeling the sting of tears in my eyes. I could hear the pain in his voice. A raw, jagged wound that nothing could mend. He took a shaky breath and continued. She said she was sorry. That she never meant for this to happen. But that doesn't change anything. Does it? I didn't know how to answer. How could I? What could I say that would make this any less of a nightmare for him? I wanted to reach through the phone, to tell him that I was there, that I'd be there for him no matter what. But the words felt hollow, empty. She admitted Ben's not mine. He continued, his voice breaking. I thought she loved me. I thought I had a family. And now it's all gone. His words cut through me like a knife. I tried to find something, anything to say that would ease his pain. But all I could manage was a soft, I'm so sorry, Liam. The days that followed were a blur. He filed for divorce almost immediately, wanting nothing to do with the woman who'd betrayed him so completely. The legal process moved faster than I'd expected. And before I knew it, the reality of the situation was set in stone. Liam and Anna were over. Their marriage shattered beyond repair. The family he'd built, the life he'd thought he had, it was all gone. Swept away by a truth he never asked for. But the worst part, the part that made it almost unbearable, was Ben. For 3 years, Liam had been Ben's father. He'd been there for every milestone, every laugh, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. And now he was faced with the truth that the child he loved with all his heart, the child he'd thought was his own, was the result of someone else's betrayal. A few weeks after he'd confronted Anna, Liam did something that shattered what little remained of our hearts. He took a DNA test. He told me he needed to be sure. Even though he already knew the truth. I didn't blame him. How could he move forward without knowing for certain? Without having something concrete to hold onto? When the results came back, confirming what we both already knew, he called me, his voice flat, empty. It's true. He's not mine. That was all he said before he hung up, leaving me standing there, phone in hand, feeling the weight of those words press down on me like a physical force. After that, he stopped talking to me as much. Not because he was angry, I think he just didn't have anything left to say. He was a shell of himself, walking through life in a daze, carrying the weight of this betrayal on his shoulders. And I could see it every time I looked at him. In the way his shoulders slumped. In the hollow look in his eyes. I'd taken away the one thing he loved most. And now he was left with nothing but the pieces of a life he couldn't fix. Ben's life was caught in the middle of it all. Liam still loved him. There was no doubt about that. But there was a shift. Something subtle yet heartbreaking. He was more reserved around Ben. Like he didn't know how to act around him anymore. I watched as he tried to be the father Ben deserved. Even as he wrestled with the knowledge that this little boy wasn't really his. He'd still take him to the park. Play with him. Tuck him in at night. But there was a sadness in his eyes that wasn't there before. A distance that I knew he couldn't shake. Watching him struggle broke my heart in ways I didn't know were possible. I felt like I'd ruined his life. Like my decision to tell him had set off a chain reaction that destroyed everything he cared about. And every time I saw him, every time I watched him with Ben, that guilt weighed heavier and heavier on me. I'd done this. I'd been the one to pull back the curtain. To reveal the truth he never wanted to know. And now, because of me, his world was shattered. My family wasn't exactly supportive, either. Some of them thought I'd done the right thing. That Liam deserved to know the truth. But others were furious, accusing me of overstepping. Of meddling in something that wasn't my business. He would have been better off not knowing. They'd say, their voices filled with judgment. You destroyed his family. Don't you think he'd rather live a lie than lose his son? I didn't have an answer for that. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should have stayed quiet. Let him live in blissful ignorance. Maybe he would have been happier not knowing. But it was too late for maybes. The truth was out, and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, I could feel the rift growing. Liam was pulling away from me. From everyone, retreating into a world of pain and isolation. And every time I saw him, every time he looked at me with that hollow, haunted expression, I felt the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me. I'd given him the truth. But at what cost? I'd taken away his happiness, his family, his peace. And now I was left to wonder if I'd done the right thing or if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. After Liam took the DNA test, there was nothing else to do but wait. Those were some of the longest days of my life. Knowing the test results would be the final confirmation. The last nail in the coffin. Somehow made everything feel even heavier. Even though we both already knew the truth. Having it written out in black and white would make it undeniable. I could see how it was tearing Liam apart. This need to know for sure. He had spent weeks questioning everything he thought was real. Reeling from Anna's betrayal. And now he was here. Waiting to see if this last piece of the life he loved could somehow still belong to him. A part of me held out hope. Too. Despite everything, I found myself imagining some twist of fate. Some miracle that would reveal Ben as Liam's child after all. It was foolish. I knew that. But the thought was like a sliver of light in an otherwise dark place. The day the results came in, Liam texted me. Just a few words. I got the results. Can you come over? I'd barely seen him since the fallout. Only catching glimpses here and there when he would come by the house to pick up things or drop Ben off. Even then, he moved through the rooms like a ghost. His face blank, hollow. Part of me wanted to tell him I couldn't bear it. That I didn't want to see him go through this all over again. But I knew I owed it to him to be there. So I grabbed my keys and drove to his house. The silence in the car thick with dread. When I arrived, he was already sitting on the couch, holding a piece of paper in his hands. He looked up when I walked in. His face a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. Without a word, he handed me the paper. I took it, reading the cold, clinical words that spelled out the truth we both feared. Ben wasn't his. My heart sank as I read the result, feeling the finality of it settle over me like a dark cloud. There was no room for doubt anymore. No last shreds of hope to cling to. Ben was not his son. Liam stared at the floor, his hands clenched into tight fists. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the pain radiating from him like a force. After a few moments, he looked up, his eyes empty, yet filled with a sadness so profound that it took my breath away. "That's it, then," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "He's not mine." None of it was real. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing I could say. All I could do was sit there in silence, feeling the weight of his sorrow pressing down on us both. He stared off into the distance, lost in thought, as if he was seeing his entire life unravel in front of him. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I still love him. You know, I look at him, and he's still my son. But, every time I see him now, it's like, I don't even know who I am to him anymore." The sadness in his words was like a dagger in my chest. I'd known this would hurt him, that he would suffer because of what I'd told him. But hearing it, seeing the devastation in his eyes, it was almost too much to bear. He loved Ben. That was the cruelest part of it all. He still loved him. Despite everything, he still felt like Ben's father. Even as that title slipped further and further from his grasp, I wanted to reassure him. To tell him that he'd always be Ben's father in a way that mattered more than biology. But I didn't think he was ready to hear it. Not now. He needed to process this in his own way, in his own time, and I had to respect that. So I sat there with him, both of us wrapped in silence, as he tried to come to terms with the truth he'd fought so hard to avoid. In the days that followed, Liam's relationship with Ben changed in ways I couldn't have anticipated. He still loved him deeply. That much was clear, but there was a hesitation in his interactions with him now. A new kind of distance. He was there for Ben, doing all the things a father should do, playing with him, reading him bedtime stories, taking him to the park. But there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A sense of loss that lingered in every hug, every gentle smile, every whispered, "I love you." It was as if Liam was trying to find his place in Ben's life all over again. But this time without the foundation of certainty he'd once had. He loved Ben, but he was also grieving the father-son bond he'd thought was unbreakable. He was trying to piece together what it meant to be Ben's father now that the biological connection was gone. But every time he looked at him, he was reminded of the betrayal, the lie that had been woven into the fabric of his family. One evening, I stopped by to check in on him, bringing some groceries and a casserole, something simple. Just a little gesture to show him I cared. I watched him with Ben. Noticed how his face softened when Ben smiled up at him. How he still reached out instinctively to steady him, to hold him close. And for a brief moment, I saw a glimmer of the old Liam, the man who had been a father in every way that mattered. But then the sadness returned. That fleeting glimpse of happiness replaced by the cold reality he was still struggling to accept. At one point, Ben ran up to him, holding out a crayon drawing with that same big, beaming smile that had melted Liam's heart 1,000 times before. "Look, Daddy, I made this for you." Liam knelt down, taking the drawing with a soft smile. But I could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the knowledge he carried. "It's beautiful, Ben. Thank you," he murmured, pulling Ben in for a hug. And in that moment, I realized that, for all his hurt and heartbreak, Liam would still choose to be there for Ben. Despite everything, despite knowing the truth, he couldn't walk away. He loved that little boy too much. Seeing that, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because, despite everything, Liam still had a piece of his heart left to give to Ben. And sadness because I knew he'd be haunted by this truth for the rest of his life. Every happy moment tinged with the reminder of the lie that had shattered his family. The confirmation from the DNA test hadn't just closed the chapter on his relationship with Anna. It had changed his entire identity as a father. He would still be there for Ben. Still love him. Still play the role he'd embraced from the beginning. But it was different now. Irrevocably altered by a truth he could never unlearn. And as much as I admired his strength, his resilience, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at me. The feeling that, in revealing the truth, I'd robbed him of a piece of himself that he could never get back. As I left that night, I looked back at Liam and Ben, sitting together on the couch. Ben showing him another drawing, chattering away happily as Liam listened with a soft, bittersweet smile. I knew that no matter what happened, no matter how much he hurt, Liam would always be Ben's father in the ways that mattered most. But I also knew that he'd never see himself the same way again. And as I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if my decision to tell him the truth had cost him more than I'd ever imagined. The fallout from my decision didn't stop with Liam. The ripple effects seemed to touch everyone, pulling our family into a quiet, simmering divide. Tensions that had always been under the surface began to bubble up. And it seemed that everyone had their own opinion about what I'd done, whether or not I should have told him, and what it meant for our family going forward. Conversations that used to be easy and full of warmth felt strained, tiptoeing around the topic that hung over us like a dark cloud. It didn't take long for the first hints of disapproval to surface. My aunt was the first to voice what I knew others were already thinking. She approached me at a family gathering, her tone hushed, her words careful but pointed. "You know, honey," she began, her voice heavy with sympathy but tinged with judgment. "Some things are better left unknown. Sometimes a family can hold together through things like this if they just don't know." Liam might have been happier not knowing the truth. Her words stung, and I found myself wondering if she might be right. After all, Liam hadn't been just happy before. He had been living in bliss. A father deeply in love with his son. A husband who adored his wife. The illusion had been perfect. Now that illusion was shattered, and the wreckage was spilling over into the rest of our family. I wanted to defend myself. To explain that I had done it out of love. That I had only wanted to be honest. To give him the chance to choose his own future. But the look in her eyes told me she'd already made up her mind. I thought that was the worst of it. But over time, other family members voiced their opinions too. My uncle was less subtle. His anger barely concealed as he confronted me during a family dinner. "You meddled in something that wasn't yours to meddle in. Liam's life, his family, that was his business. You didn't have the right to destroy it." Each word felt like a slap, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. A mixture of shame and frustration. I hadn't meddled. I wanted to scream. I'd told Liam because I thought he deserved to know the truth. But the eyes around the table seemed to hold me responsible for the unraveling of our family. Their silent judgment pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. And it wasn't just the older members of the family. Even my cousins seemed wary. Their once easy smiles now replaced with guarded glances. Conversations felt forced, and every mention of Liam or Ben brought a hush over the room. As though talking about them would somehow invite more disaster. The people who'd once been my closest confidants. The ones who had always been there through the ups and downs. Now looked at me like I was a stranger. My mother was the only one who stood by me. Her voice quiet but firm in her belief that I'd done the right thing. "Liam deserved to know," she would say, whenever the topic came up. "You did what you thought was right. And that's all any of us can do." Her support was the one thing that kept me grounded. Kept me from drowning in the guilt and doubt that seemed to follow me everywhere. But even her words couldn't fully quiet the nagging doubts in my mind. In the privacy of my own thoughts, those doubts grew louder. Had I really done the right thing? Would Liam's life, and Ben's, have been better if I'd kept quiet? I began replaying every moment that had led me to that choice. Second-guessing myself, wondering if I'd acted out of love or some deeper, unacknowledged need to disrupt the life I'd always felt was somehow wrong. My own motives became blurry, and I found myself spiraling into a kind of self-doubt I'd never experienced before. There were times I'd lie awake at night, wrestling with the guilt that now felt like a permanent weight in my chest. I'd think about Liam, trying to imagine how he was coping, what he was feeling. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see his face that day in the cafe. The way he'd looked at me, shocked and betrayed, as if I'd ripped his heart out and handed it to him. Raw and bleeding, the memory haunted me, twisting the knife of guilt deeper each time it resurfaced. Family gatherings became an exercise in endurance. I'd watch Liam from a distance, noting the way he moved, slower and more deliberate than before, Like he was carrying a weight only he could feel. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was a shadow of the easy grin he used to wear. Seeing him like that, knowing I'd played a part in it, was almost unbearable. I'd find myself slipping away to empty rooms, hiding from the disapproving stares. The whispers I knew were happening behind my back. It didn't help that, in my weaker moments, I started to wonder if those who were angry with me were right. The words of my aunt, my uncle, and even some of my cousins echoed in my mind. He would have been better off not knowing. I started to imagine what life would have been like if I'd kept silent. If I'd let Liam live in that blissful ignorance, he would still be happy, still be the doting father to Ben, still have the family he'd dreamed of. The thought of that alternate reality clawed at me, filling me with regret that I couldn't shake. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. I'd told him the truth because I couldn't stand the thought of him living a lie, of him investing his whole heart into something built on betrayal. I'd thought I was protecting him, giving him the chance to live authentically, even if it meant facing a painful reality. And yet, as I looked at the broken man he'd become, I couldn't ignore the possibility that I'd only brought him pain. Over time, I became more isolated, withdrawing from family events whenever I could, keeping my distance. My relationship with Liam grew colder, too. He didn't blame me outright, at least not in words, but there was a quiet distance between us now. A kind of unspoken barrier that I didn't know how to cross. I could see that every time he looked at me, he was reminded of the truth I'd delivered, the truth that had ripped his life apart. Friends asked me about him sometimes, those who knew parts of the story, and I struggled to find the words. How could I explain that the person I loved most in the world, my own brother, now looked at me like I was a stranger? That I could feel the love between us slipping away, bit by bit, as he tried to rebuild a life that would never be the same? I felt like I was losing him, piece by piece, and the pain of that loss only fueled my guilt and regret. I began to wonder if there was a way to make amends, to somehow put things back together. But I knew it was impossible. I couldn't unsay the words, couldn't erase the knowledge I'd given him. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. All I could do was live with the consequences, to accept that my decision had set things in motion that I could no longer control. Some nights, I would sit alone, trying to reconcile the person I'd been, the sister who thought she was protecting her brother, with the person I'd become. The woman haunted by the consequences of her own actions. I knew I had done what I believed was right, but right didn't feel like a comfort anymore. It felt like a curse, a burden I'd carry forever. And so, I waited, watching Liam from the sidelines as he pieced his life back together. Bit by bit, every day, I held out a quiet hope that maybe, one day, he'd look at me again with the warmth we'd once shared, that he'd see me not as the person who destroyed his happiness, but as the sister who had tried, in her own flawed way, to save him. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, that hope grew fainter, slipping away like sand through my fingers, leaving me with nothing but the hollow ache of regret. With each passing day, the guilt only seemed to deepen, a quiet ache that had settled into my chest, present in every quiet moment, in every thought of Liam and Ben. I found myself questioning everything I'd done, replaying the decision I made to tell him, hoping to find something, anything, that could assure me I'd done the right thing. But there was no comfort to be found in those memories, no relief in examining my motives over and over. All I could see was the devastation that had unfolded because of my choice. The family that had been torn apart, and the love that felt broken beyond repair. Some days, I could hardly recognize myself. I had always thought of myself as someone who believed in honesty above all else. Someone who would want the truth no matter how painful it might be. But now, standing in the ruins of the life my brother had once cherished, I wasn't so sure. Was the truth really worth it if it left everyone shattered? Or had I only clung to the idea of honesty because I wanted to believe it would bring some higher form of justice? Some closure that was nowhere to be found? I started to wonder if, deep down, my decision to tell him hadn't been about protecting him at all. Maybe it had been about proving something to myself, about Anna. About my own ability to see through her. About my loyalty to my brother. I hated the thought, The idea that my motives might have been anything other than pure. But the more I thought about it, the harder it became to deny. My gut feeling about Anna had been right. And perhaps part of me had wanted that validation. Had wanted to be proven right even if it came at the cost of my brother's happiness. The shame of that realization cut deep. And I began to spiral into a kind of self-doubt I'd never experienced before. I was used to being confident in my decisions, trusting my instincts, and believing that I knew what was best for the people I loved. But now, I felt like a stranger to myself, questioning every choice, every instinct. I had thought I was helping him, but all I'd done was tear his world apart. And for what? So I could feel like I'd done the right thing. I started to avoid my own reflection, seeing myself in the mirror, with the weight of those choices etched into my face, was almost unbearable. I didn't want to look into my own eyes and see the doubt, the regret that had taken root there. I'd done something irreversible, something that couldn't be undone no matter how much I wished I could turn back time. And with each passing day, I felt the person I'd once been slipping further away. The guilt affected everything I did. I lost focus at work, drifting through the day in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of the past few months, searching for some other path I could have taken. My friendships started to feel strained. Too, I found myself withdrawing, hesitant to share anything about my life, afraid that my friends would judge me the way my family had. I didn't want to hear more opinions on whether I'd done the right thing or the wrong thing. I'd heard enough to last a lifetime. But even when they didn't ask, I felt their curiosity, their uncertainty, and it only deepened the isolation I felt. There were nights I'd lie awake, my mind a relentless spiral of what ifs and if onlys. What if I had kept quiet? What if I had let Liam live in blissful ignorance, giving him the chance to raise Ben without the shadow of betrayal? What if I'd never overheard that conversation? If I had walked out before hearing those words? Would any of this pain have existed if I had just kept my distance? Somehow, I began to wonder if the whole thing had been a test of my loyalty, my integrity, or maybe just my capacity to do what I thought was right. And if it was a test, I wasn't sure I'd passed. In fact, it felt like I'd failed, and failed in the worst way possible. I'd let my own sense of righteousness lead me down a path that had ended in heartbreak for everyone involved. And now, I was left with nothing but the aftermath, the fragments of a decision that could never be put back together. My family's judgment lingered in my mind as well, the things they had said replaying over and over, their voices as relentless as my own self-doubt. I'd grown up believing in family loyalty, in the unspoken promise that we would always protect each other, no matter what. But by telling Liam, had I broken that promise? Had I betrayed not just him, but the rest of our family, by choosing honesty over peace? In the end, the only thing I knew for certain was that there was no going back. I had made my choice, and I would have to live with it, no matter how heavy that burden became. Some days, I tried to convince myself that, in time, the guilt would fade, that I'd find a way to come to terms with what I'd done. But most days, that felt like a hollow hope, a lie I told myself to keep going. There were moments when I considered reaching out to Liam, to try and explain the turmoil I'd been going through, the guilt that had taken hold of me. But every time I thought about it, I stopped myself. I knew he didn't need to hear my apologies, my regrets. He didn't need to bear the weight of my guilt on top of everything else he was already carrying. And so I kept it to myself, letting it fester in the quiet spaces of my life, hoping that one day it might find a way to lessen on its own. Looking back, I could see that I'd acted out of love, a love so deep and fierce that it had blinded me to the consequences of my actions. But love, I realized, wasn't always enough. Sometimes, even love could be destructive, could lead us down paths we never meant to take, leaving us with nothing but a hollow ache and the echoes of a family we'd once thought was unbreakable. And so, I carried on, moving through each day as best I could, my heart heavy with guilt and regret, my mind filled with questions that would never have answers. I knew I'd have to live with the consequences of my choice, that I'd never truly be free of the shadow it had cast over my life. But maybe, just maybe, in the quiet moments, I could find a sliver of peace, a small comfort in knowing that, no matter the cost, I had acted out of love. And maybe, someday, that would be enough. In the months that followed, life moved forward, as it always does, even when you're caught in a storm you thought would never end. Time passed in quiet, unremarkable ways, and though nothing felt truly healed, the wounds began to scar over. There was a new normal now. One that felt fragile and strange. Like a thin layer of ice over deep water. Liam and I both lived with the shattered pieces of our choices. Each of us trying, in our own way, to rebuild what had been lost. Liam had found a routine with Ben. A rhythm that suited them both. I could see that he was trying, in ways both small and large, to be the father Ben deserved. Despite the weight of his grief, he still took him to the park on weekends, holding his hand as they walked along the winding paths, watching over him with the same careful eyes he'd had before everything changed. But even as he poured love into those moments, there was a distance, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air, a reminder of the truth that could never be forgotten. At first, I kept my distance, letting them find their way without my presence complicating things. I knew I wasn't fully welcome. That every visit was a reminder of what I had done, of the life I had helped change forever. I wanted to give them the space they needed to heal, to find their own balance without my shadow looming over them. But as time went on, I felt an ache to be closer, to be part of Liam and Ben's life again, even if it was in a different way than before. One afternoon, after months of keeping to myself, I finally gathered the courage to reach out to Liam. I texted him, a simple message. I miss you and Ben. Would it be alright if I stopped by sometime? I stared at my phone for what felt like forever, my stomach churning with nerves. I didn't know if he would reply, if he would still want me in their lives after everything that had happened. To my surprise, his response came quickly. Sure. Ben would love to see you. There was a cautious warmth in his words, a small flicker of the relationship we'd once had, and it gave me a glimmer of hope. I went over to his house that weekend, trying not to let my nerves show, doing my best to act natural. When I arrived, Ben ran up to me, his face lighting up in that way only a child's can. And in that moment, all the fear and doubt melted away. He didn't understand the complications, the tangled mess of emotions and betrayals that had come between us. To him, I was just his aunt, someone who loved him, someone he could trust. I hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his small arms around me, a warmth I hadn't realized I'd missed so deeply. Liam was quieter, more reserved, but he welcomed me in, offering me a cup of coffee as if this were just another Saturday visit. Like things hadn't changed at all. I knew it wasn't easy for him, that he was still processing everything, still trying to find his footing in a world that had been turned upside down. But he was here, and he was making an effort. And that alone meant more than words could say. The visit was short, a brief window into the life they were building together. But it felt like a step in the right direction. As I left, I felt a cautious optimism blooming in my chest. I knew things would never go back to the way they were before. That our relationship would always be marked by what had happened. But maybe, with time, we could forge something new. Something that honored the past while acknowledging the pain we'd both endured. In the months that followed, I began visiting more regularly. Small steps toward reconnecting with Liam and Ben. Toward rebuilding the bond that had once been so strong. Each visit felt like a test. A reminder of the fragility of our relationship. But it also felt like a chance to show Liam that I was still his sister. That I was still someone he could rely on. Someone who loved him deeply. Even if my actions had caused him pain. It was during one of these visits, while Ben was napping, that Liam and I finally spoke about what had happened. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees. And he turned to me, his face a mixture of sadness and acceptance. You know, he said quietly, I think I'll always be a little broken by what happened. But I also think I can live with it now. I love Ben, and I'm going to be there for him. No matter what, he deserves that. I nodded, feeling a surge of respect for him. For his resilience. For his ability to find a path forward despite everything. I'm proud of you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. For sticking by him. He's lucky to have you. He gave me a small, sad smile. I'm not doing it for luck. I'm doing it because it's what he needs. And because, despite everything, he's still my son. There was a peace in his words. A calm acceptance that soothed some of the guilt that had been gnawing at me for so long. I realized, in that moment, that while I could never undo the pain I had caused, I could honor his journey, his strength, by being there for him, by being part of the family he was determined to hold together. The guilt and regret would always be part of me, shadows that would linger in quiet moments. But I was beginning to understand that they didn't have to define me. I could still be a sister. Still be someone Liam could trust. Someone who loved him and wanted the best for him. I could still be part of his life. Even if that life looked different than it once had. Over time, my visits with Ben became a source of joy. Moments where I could reconnect with the love I'd felt for him before the truth had come to light. I watched him grow, watched him thrive under Liam's steady, unwavering care, and I felt a deep gratitude that, despite everything, he had a father who loved him more than words could say. Liam might not have been his biological father, but he was his dad in every way that mattered. And I knew that was something no one could ever take away. The journey toward closure wasn't easy. And it wasn't linear. There were days when the guilt would resurface. Moments when I would find myself questioning everything again, wondering if I could have done things differently. But in those moments, I held on to the small signs of healing. The fragile threads of a new normal that Liam and I were creating together. I focused on the future. On the love that still connected us. On the family we were rebuilding. Piece by piece. And as time went on, I began to believe that, while we would always carry the weight of what had happened, we could also find peace. We could create a future where the pain didn't define us. Where love and forgiveness held more power than the mistakes we'd made. It wasn't perfect. And it wasn't easy. But it was enough. And sometimes, that was all we needed. Looking back, it's hard to reconcile everything that's happened. Everything we've lost and gained. With the family we once were. My decision to tell Liam the truth had changed everything. Our family. Our relationships. And most of all, the way I understood love and loyalty. But even with all the pain and regret that came with it, I don't think I could have chosen differently. Because love, for better or worse, sometimes demands that we reveal what's hidden. Even if it hurts more than we ever imagined. I still see the shadows of that day lingering around us. Little reminders that nothing is as simple as it once was. Family gatherings aren't quite the same. And the hushed, judgmental tones of some relatives have never fully faded. Yet, despite the fractured nature of our family, I've found strength in the small moments of connection we still manage to create. There's a resilience in Liam. A quiet fortitude that I didn't see before. He still wrestles with the pain of what happened. But he's also found a way to love Ben wholly. To be present for him without letting the past define them. And that, in itself, has shown me a side of loyalty I never fully understood. My relationship with Liam isn't what it was before. And I suppose it never will be. But it's something real. Something stronger and more honest than it might have been otherwise. There's an unspoken understanding between us now. A kind of mutual respect that came only after surviving something that could have torn us apart. We've both changed in ways that are impossible to ignore. And while we're not as close as we once were, we've found a way to care for each other. To move forward without letting the weight of the past anchor us. Ben, sweet and resilient as he is, has become a reminder of all the ways life can surprise us. He still calls Liam, Dad, without a second thought. Still throws his arms around him with the pure, unquestioning love only a child can give. Watching them together, I've come to realize that love, in its truest form, doesn't require shared blood. It's forged in the small, ordinary moments. The bedtime stories. The laughter. The quiet reassurance of a father's hand. Liam has given Ben that love. Despite everything. And that realization has given me a measure of peace. In my quiet moments, I still think about the truth I revealed and the cost it came with. I understand now that honesty and loyalty don't always coexist in the clean, simple way we're taught to believe. Sometimes, loyalty to the truth means sacrificing the peace of those we care about. And the love that drives us to be honest can leave us scarred. But there's a raw, redemptive quality to facing the truth. To knowing that the love that binds us can endure. Even when it's tested. I've come to accept that I'll always carry a certain weight. A lingering shadow of guilt for the way things turned out. The decision I made, for better or worse, changed us all, and in doing so, changed me too. But I no longer see that weight as a burden, instead. It's a reminder of the complexity of love, of the ways it can surprise us, challenge us, and ultimately, redefine us. And that's a truth I can live with. When I think about the future, I don't pretend that everything will be easy, or that the scars we carry will disappear. I know there will be moments when the past resurfaces, when the pain of that choice will sting again, catching us off guard. But I also know that we're stronger now. That the foundation we've rebuilt, however fragile, is grounded in something real and lasting. And maybe that's all anyone can hope for, to be able to love through the imperfections, to forgive ourselves and each other, and to keep moving forward, no matter what. If nothing else, this journey has taught me that family is more than a simple connection. It's a choice we make, a bond we strengthen even when it's tested. A commitment to stand by each other through the truths that hurt and heal us alike. And though I'll never stop feeling the weight of what I did, I can live with it, knowing that love, even flawed, painful love, is what has kept us together. As I sit here, reflecting on the years that have passed and the lessons I've learned, I feel a strange, bittersweet gratitude. The path we walked was messy, filled with hurt and doubt, but it was ours, and despite everything, we're still here, still standing, still finding our way. We've woven a new kind of family from the pieces that were left. One that is more resilient, more honest, and perhaps more beautiful for all its scars. In the end, I've come to see that love is a complicated, imperfect thing, but it's also the reason we keep going. It's what gives us the courage to face the truth, to forgive, and to try again, even when the past feels like it might pull us under. And as I look at Liam, at Ben, and at the family we've created from the wreckage, I feel a quiet, enduring hope that we'll find peace, not in perfection, but in the imperfect, resilient love that binds us together.